The trooper's flashlight stopped on her window like a verdict. He stood beside the black sedan with one hand on his belt, the other holding a ticket book that smelled faintly of paper and rainwater, and the white beam bounced off the woman's windshield in hard silver flashes. Inside the dashboard glowed soft amber across her face. She kept both hands where he could see them, fingers relaxed on the wheel, while the engine clicked quietly under the hood. "License and registration," he said, dragging the words out as if he owned the road beneath her tires. The woman reached into her glove box with slow, deliberate movements, then set her documents in plain view, her sleeve sliding back just enough to show a crisp, dark uniform cuff and a thin gold pin near her wrist. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose not to. The officer leaned closer, catching the clean scent of leather from the seat and the faint metallic bite of his own badge against the humid night air. "You people always got somewhere to be," he muttered, eyes narrowing at the photo on her license. She said nothing. Her gaze stayed on his face, steady and unreadable, like she was waiting for a report to be filed. He tapped the license against the open window frame, then glanced toward the rearview mirror, where the glow from his cruiser painted the interior in rotating red and blue. "Step out of the car," he ordered. She opened the door with the quiet click of a well-kept vehicle, and when she stepped onto the pavement, her shoes landed with a precise, polished sound against the rough asphalt. The night smelled like hot rubber and exhaust. A passing truck rumbled in the distance, briefly shaking the loose leaves at the curb. The trooper looked her up and down, taking in her plain coat, her calm posture, the simple silver watch on her left wrist. He saw a black woman standing alone at a roadside stop and decided the story before she ever spoke. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "No, sir," she said, her voice even almost polite. That answer seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. He let out a short laugh, then pointed toward the lane behind her. "You were drifting. Looked suspicious." She turned her head just enough to follow the line of his finger, then looked back at him with the kind of stillness that makes a man check his own reflection. The officer's radio crackled from the cruiser, a burst of static and clipped voices, but he ignored it. He stepped closer, too close, the brim of his hat cutting a sharp shadow over his eyes. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked. "Base," she replied. That single word seemed to hang between them. Not because it was loud, because it was precise. The trooper blinked once, then gave a dismissive nod, as if he had heard enough nonsense for one night. "Base, huh? Sure, and I'm the governor." He smiled at his own joke, but she did not. Instead, she looked past him at the open passenger seat, where a leather folder sat half-hidden beneath a folded map. On the corner of the folder, just visible under the cruiser's red flash, was an embossed seal he had not yet seen. He reached for her arm anyway, fingers hovering near the fabric of her coat, and that was when she finally moved one small motion, calm and exact, sliding her hand down to the folder and opening it to the first page. Inside was a photo ID, a line of official text, and a title that made the trooper's mouth go dry before he had even read it all the way through. The trooper stared at the page as if the paper itself had changed shape in his hands. Inside the cruiser, the radio crackled low and thin, a burst of static cutting through the wet night air. Blue light washed over the dashboard, over his knuckles, over the laminated card he had just pulled free from the folder. Colonel Mara Ellis, U.S. Army. His jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. Outside rain tapped steadily against the hood, in soft, nervous clicks, and the woman he had pulled over stood under the orange glow of the shoulder lamp, with her hands folded at her sides, motionless, except for the slow rise of her breath. He glanced from the ID to her face, then back again, as if hoping the name would rearrange itself into something easier. "Colonel," he said at last, the word rough in his throat. She did not answer right away. She reached into the folder, turned one page, and held it toward the windshield where the flashing lights could catch the seal stamped in dark green ink. The trooper leaned closer, and the scent of damp wool, wet pavement, and old leather drifted into the cab. It was an official order packet. At the top, in clean military type, was a directive authorizing her movement through the county, signed and dated that afternoon. His eyes moved fast, now skimming lines he clearly wished had not existed. On the shoulder behind him, the second patrol car sat angled across the lane engine, idling exhaust steaming into the cold. The backup officer stepped out of that car and shut the door with a heavy metallic thud, then froze when he saw the folder in Mara's hand. "What is it?" he called, his voice muffled by the rain. The trooper did not answer. He was still staring at the colonel's photo, then at the woman standing in front of him in a dark coat speckled with rain, then at the rank bars on the document as if they had been added to humiliate him personally. Mara closed the folder with one firm motion and tucked it against her chest. You stopped an army colonel on a federal route, she said, her voice level carried by the wind more than by volume. The words landed cleanly. The backup officer shifted his weight on the wet asphalt, one hand sliding instinctively toward his radio. The trooper swallowed and took a half step back, the edge of the open cruiser door creaking as it swung in the wind. Then Mara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a second card, this one smaller with a red stripe along the top and a number printed beneath a seal. He recognized just enough to understand the danger of misunderstanding it. She held it up not to threaten, but to make him read. The trooper's face changed as soon as the first line came into view. He looked like a man realizing too late that the ground beneath him had been marked with a boundary he had crossed in the dark. The backup officer took 2 quick steps forward, peering over his shoulder. "Sir," he muttered, though there was no "sir" in the scene. Mara lowered the card and glanced toward the front of the cruiser, where her taillights still glowed red against the rain. "You can write the warning and send me on my way," she said. "Or you can keep this lane closed and explain to your supervisor why you detained an authorized officer with classified transport clearance." The trooper's fingers tightened around the citation pad in his hand. The paper bent. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low over the trees. He looked toward the second officer, then back at Mara, and for the first time since the stop began, he did not have the next move ready. Instead, he stepped aside and opened the cruiser's front door wider, as if making room for something much larger than a routine traffic stop. Mara did not move yet. She only waited, one hand resting on the folder, the other still holding the red striped card, while the rain kept falling, and the trooper's radio hissed with a voice calling for an update he was no longer prepared to give. The trooper finally cleared his throat and took one step back from the driver's window, but the lane behind him stayed frozen in the wet gray, light blue reflections sliding over puddles, and the hood of Mara's sedan like broken glass. "Colonel," he said, the word rough in his mouth. "Now, if you'll just hand me the transport folder, I can verify everything with dispatch." Mara did not move fast. She slid the folder across her lap and set it on the steering wheel, where he could see the sealed label, the military markings, the stamped routing code. Rain tapped steadily against the roof, a dry chemical smell drifting from the cruiser's idling engines, mixing with the sharp scent of wet asphalt and burnt coffee from the cup holder. The second officer leaned in from the passenger side, his flashlight beam catching the edge of Mara's rank insignia, and then the black case clipped beneath her seat. He hesitated, hands still half raised, as if he had reached for authority and found something heavier waiting there. Mara opened the folder just enough to show the top page, and then she tapped one line with 2 fingers. The gesture was small, but it changed the air. The trooper red blinked once and looked toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Sir," he said into it, voice suddenly measured, "I've got a U.S. Army colonel here with a sealed federal escort route." Static crackled back at him, then a dispatcher's voice asking for confirmation on the plate number. Mara watched his jaw tighten as he repeated the digits slow and exact. The sedan's wipers made their steady sweep, squeaking against the windshield, while the storm darkened the tree line beyond the shoulder and the lane lights shone pale over the wet guardrail. "You asked for my license," Mara said, still calm, her hand resting flat on the wheel. "Now you have it. So what exactly is the problem?" The first officer looked at the citation pad, again, then at the folder, then at her face. His pen hovered over the paper. It did not touch down. For a long moment, only the rain and the radio filled the space between them. Then the dispatcher came back sharper this time. "Unit 12, advise if the vehicle is clear to proceed." The trooper swallowed, but before he could answer, another set of headlights appeared behind the cruisers, bright and deliberate, cutting through the mist like a warning. Both officers turned at once. Mara did not. She only lifted her eyes toward the mirror, and when she saw the vehicle stop behind them, her gloved hand closed once around the folder as the lane fell into a deeper silence. The headlights behind the cruisers burned through the rain like a second judgment, and the first trooper took 2 steps back from Mara's window, as if the cold air itself had pushed him. The new vehicle rolled to a stop with a low engine hum, tires hissing over the wet asphalt, and when the driver's door opened, a man in a dark raincoat stepped out carrying a slim black umbrella that clicked once against the frame. He moved with the kind of quiet control that made the whole lane feel smaller. The silver edge of his folder flashed under the floodlights as he crossed the slick pavement, his shoes making a measured tap against the painted line. Mara's eyes stayed forward. The troopers did not. "Ma'am," the man said, stopping just outside the reach of the cruiser lights, "step out of the vehicle, please." The first officer blinked hard. "Sir, this is a routine stop." The man turned his head just enough to look at him. "Then you should have no problem standing at attention." Rain ticked on the umbrella like nails on glass. The younger trooper swallowed and straightened so fast his radio clipped against his vest. Mara opened her door slowly, one hand on the frame, the other still holding the folder. The inside of the car smelled faintly of wet wool and leather, and a strip of dashboard light painted her sleeve a dull green. She stepped onto the pavement without rushing, the water darkening the hem of her coat. The man in the raincoat took one look at the folder in her hand and gave a single nod. "Colonel Ellis," he said, his voice level over the rain, "I was told there was an issue with your clearance." The first trooper's mouth parted. "Colonel," the word fell out thin and disbelieving. Mara handed the folder over without ceremony. Inside, beneath the state permit and travel orders, the black and gold insignia caught the light and threw it back hard enough to make the closest officer look away for a second. The man in the raincoat opened the folder, scanned one page then another, and closed it with a soft slap. "You made her wait in the rain for this?" he asked. Nobody answered. A distant truck rumbled across the overpass, and the sound rolled through the underpass like thunder. The first trooper's knuckles went white around his citation pad. "We were verifying." "No," the man cut in, still calm, still quiet, and somehow that made it worse. He lifted one hand toward the cruisers parked nose to nose across the lane. "You were looking for a reason to keep her here." The younger officer's radio squawked. He nearly dropped it when the dispatcher's voice crackled through, asking for a status update. Mara reached into her coat and removed a folded, laminated credential with a red border. She held it up just long enough for both troopers to see the seal. The older one took one step back and bumped into the open door of his cruiser. Metal clanged against metal. The man in the raincoat closed Mara's car door himself, gently, then faced the officers again. "From this point on," he said, "you will address Colonel Ellis properly, and you will explain why 2 patrol units escalated a traffic stop on a military officer in an authorized convoy lane." The rain kept falling. The lane had gone so still that even the radio hiss sounded loud. Mara's hand stayed on the folder steady, while the first trooper's face drained under the pale wash of the floodlights. Then another set of brakes hissed somewhere behind them, and both officers looked up just as a third vehicle arrived, this one marked with federal plates. The back door opened, and a woman in a gray suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase against her chest. She did not look at the troopers first. She looked at Mara. "Colonel," she said, "we're here because your name was just placed on the emergency review list." The woman in the gray suit set the briefcase on Mara's hood, its metal corners clicking softly against the wet paint as rain slid in silver threads off the windshield. The floodlights turned the whole roadside into a white stage, and the 2 troopers stood under it like men who had already lost their lines. She opened the case, drew out a sealed packet, and held it up without looking away from Mara. "Emergency Review Authority," she said. "Temporary stand-down for every unit on this scene." The first trooper took one step forward, then stopped when Mara reached into her folder and withdrew a laminated credential so clean it caught the light like glass. She did not raise her voice. She just held it chest high, where both officers could read the rank, the branch, and the signature across the bottom. The rain tapped against the badge in tiny, steady bursts. A dispatcher's voice crackled from one cruiser, distorted by static and distance, calling for confirmation on a military stop that had now drawn federal review. The second trooper glanced toward the road behind them, where headlights were beginning to gather in the dark, like a slow-moving line of witnesses. Mara closed the folder, then placed it on the hood beside the briefcase, the sound flat and final. "You have 2 choices," the woman in gray said, still calm, still precise. "You step back, lower your hands, and let Colonel Ellis continue this conversation in the proper chain of command. Or you keep standing here and explain to your captain why you ignored a visible convoy marker, a lawful route assignment, and a direct request for verification." The first trooper's mouth opened, but no words came out. His radio hissed again, then popped with a new transmission, this one sharper, calling for both officers to identify themselves to federal liaison. Mara turned slightly, and the wet collar of her uniform caught a pale strip of light, the fabric darkened by rain and pressed clean against her neck. She reached into the car through the open door and took out a small military envelope that had been resting on the passenger seat, then handed it to the woman in gray without breaking eye contact with the troopers. The envelope was embossed, the seal intact, the corner already softened by the damp air. The woman in gray broke the seal, read one line, and looked up at once. "They've already notified the duty office," she said. "If this stop is not cleared in the next 60 seconds, the review board moves from administrative to immediate." Behind them, another vehicle rolled to a stop, then another. Tires hissed on water. Doors began opening in sequence. The officers finally stepped back from the car. Not much, just enough for Mara to reach her door without touching either of them. And when she did, She paused with one hand on the frame and looked at the first trooper as if the next sentence belonged to him alone. Now she said, "Tell me exactly why you thought you could hold a U.S. colonel here in the rain." The troopers in the parking lot held their ground for one more breath, rain ticking against their patrol cars and sliding in silver threads down the windshields. Mara did not move from the open door until the woman in gray gave the slightest nod. Then she stepped out into the cold air with the same controlled pace she had used since the first flashlight hit her mirror. Water darkened the hem of her coat at once. The lane markers glowed under the street lamps, slick and white, and the smell of wet asphalt rose sharp around them. Colonel, one of the younger officers, said, glancing at the sealed envelope in the woman in gray's hand, "This can still be handled quietly." Mara reached back into the car, took out her leather case, and set it on the roof with a flat, deliberate sound. "Quietly ended when you pulled me over," she said. "Now I want your names, your unit numbers, and the reason my rear window got blocked while I was driving through this county." The older trooper shifted his weight, radio clipped tight at his shoulder, rainwater shining on the brim of his hat. He looked once toward the two cruisers that had just arrived, then back at her collar, where the insignia caught the light each time the sirens in the distance pulsed red through the rain. He reached for his belt, stopped, then slowly removed his hat. "We were told to wait for confirmation," he said. Mara opened the leather case. Inside, beneath a folder marked with a plain black tab, sat her ID and a folded travel order stamped for immediate review. She lifted the order only high enough for the nearest camera to see the seal. "You have it," she said. "Read it aloud." The officer's mouth tightened as he took the paper with 2 fingers, the edges damp already from the weather. Behind him, a state supervisor pushed through the line of headlights, shoes splashing through shallow puddles, a phone already pressed to his ear. He did not look at the patrol cars first. He looked at Mara, then at her rank, then at the troopers who had stopped her. "Stand down," he said into the phone, voice low and urgent, and whatever answer came back made his shoulders drop by an inch. He turned cross to the nearest cruiser and reached inside through the open driver's window. When he came back, he held a citation book in one hand and the dashcam card in the other. He looked at the younger trooper. "Turn in your badge," he said. The words landed hard in the wet air. The younger man blinked. "Sir, now." Mara did not raise her voice. She simply closed the leather case, latched it, and rested one hand on top of it as another vehicle rolled in behind the supervisor's truck, then another after that, forming a quiet line of authority in the rain. The woman in gray stepped closer, umbrella folded at her side, and held out a final page from the envelope. "Your clearance," she told Mara, "is no longer the issue. Their jurisdiction just ended." Mara took the page, folded it once, and looked at the older trooper with the same steady expression she had worn when she first lowered her window. "Now," she said, "I'm giving you one chance to tell the truth before my office asks why a U.S. colonel was detained here for 43 minutes. Mara let the paper rest in her hand for one beat longer, the rain tapping against the cruiser roof in a steady metallic rhythm. The older trooper stood under the flashing red bar lights with his jaw locked and his hat brim shining dark with water. Behind him, the younger one had already stepped back from the patrol car, one hand half raised, as if he were trying to decide whether to help or disappear. The woman in gray remained beside Mara's truck, her umbrella still folded, her heels sinking slightly into the soaked gravel. 43 minutes, Mara said, folding the clearance page and slipping it into the inner pocket of her coat. "Then let's make the next 43 seconds count." She opened the leather case again, not slowly, not for drama, but with the clean, practiced motion of someone who had done this in briefing rooms, hangars, and command tents all over the country. Inside, beneath the credentials and sealed orders, lay a slim black phone with a government encryption band and a folded deployment sheet stamped in blue. The older trooper's eyes moved to the stamp, then away. "Colonel," he said, the word catching in his throat and coming out smaller than before. Mara reached into the case, took out the phone, and turned it so the screen faced him. The display was already lit. One missed call, then another, then 3 in a row. The name at the top was not a local supervisor, not county dispatch, not even state command. It was a general in Washington. A gust of cold air pushed through the lot, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and diesel from the highway beyond the median. Mara thumbed the call log and held the phone up just enough for both troopers to see the list of unanswered attempts. "You were told to release me," she said. "You were told twice." The younger trooper swallowed and looked at the older man. No one answered. The woman in gray took one step forward and opened a second folder from under her arm. Inside were printed timestamps, dashcam stills, and a chain of command notice with red borders around every page. She placed it on the hood of the supervisor's truck, where the rain began to pepper the ink. "This is the record," she said. "Every stop, every delay, every refusal to comply." The older trooper reached for the folder, but she put one hand on it first. Not hard, just enough to stop him. Mara slid her badge case into her coat and looked past both men toward the road, where headlights rolled by in a soft blur through the rain. "Here is what happens now," she said, her voice even as the wipers on the nearest cruiser squealed across the glass. "You step aside, you radio your command, and you tell them exactly who you held on the shoulder." The older trooper opened his mouth, then shut it again when another vehicle pulled in behind the line. Then another after that, white and black silhouettes gathering in the storm like a quiet answer arriving on time. Mara put the phone back to her ear, not to call for help, but to answer the call that had been waiting since the stop began. "Sir," she said into the receiver, eyes fixed on the road ahead, "they've confirmed my location. Send the memorandum now. I want every name that touched this stop before sunrise." The convoy lights arrived first, then the command SUV, its tires hissing over the wet shoulder, as if the road itself had started whispering back. Mara stayed where she was, one boot planted beside the white line, her coat dark with rain, the gold eagle on her collar catching stray bursts of blue and red from the cruisers. The younger trooper shifted his weight and kept glancing at the badge case in her hand, while the older one stood rigid under the patrol light, jaw set so tight it looked carved from stone. From inside the SUV came the sharp crackle of a radio and the dry rustle of paperwork being pulled free from a folder. Colonel Hayes stepped out into the rain with a hard face and a clipboard tucked under one arm, then stopped the moment he saw Mara's rank pin and the two-star insignia stamped on the side of her travel case. The road smelled like soaked asphalt and hot brake pads. "You were told this was a routine stop," he said. Not to her, but to the troopers. Nobody answered. Mara reached into her coat and took out a folded order sheet, the paper already soft at the edges from the damp. She held it up just long enough for Hayes to read the header, then handed it to him without a word. His eyes moved once across the page, then again, then stopped. One of the state troopers took a half step back, as though the shoulder had suddenly narrowed. "Sir," the older trooper said, looking at Hayes now instead of Mara, "we had probable cause." Mara lifted her gaze toward him and let the rain tap quietly against her sleeve. "You stopped a uniformed officer on an interstate because of a broken taillight," she said. "Then you pulled me out of my vehicle, searched my bag, and kept me standing here for 27 minutes while you argued about who I was." The younger trooper swallowed. A siren passed somewhere farther down the road, fading into the storm. Hayes flipped the page again and found the line he had missed the first time, the one with his own name in the chain of command response. He looked up and the color drained from his face in the flashing light. "Colonel," he said lower, "now I can explain." Mara took one slow step closer, the rubber soles of her boots making a muted sound against the wet shoulder. "No," she said. "You can report." Behind them, another set of headlights appeared through the rain. Then another, a line of vehicles stretching back like a corridor of witnesses arriving on cue. One trooper reached for his radio, hesitated, and lowered it again when Mara nodded toward the command SUV. "Open the log," she said. "Now." Hayes turned sharply to his driver. "Do it." The folder came open on the hood with a slap of wet paper, and the floodlight from the cruiser turned every page a pale, unforgiving white. Mara pointed once, not at the names, but at the time stamps. The stop, the search, the delay, the radio silence. Each entry sat there in order, clean and undeniable. The older trooper stared at the page as if it had started speaking in a language he could finally understand. Mara straightened the cuff of her coat and looked at Hayes with the same steady calm she had carried onto the shoulder. "You have 10 minutes, she said, "to decide whether this stays a traffic stop or becomes a command issue." Then she reached into her pocket, drew out a second phone, and unlocked it with her thumb as the rain thickened around them, because the next call was no longer about permission. It was about who would be named when the night was done. The rain kept sliding off the hood in silver threads while the cruiser lights painted the roadside in hard blue and red. Hayes stood by the open folder, one hand on his belt, the other near the radio that had gone quiet too long. Mara did not move from where she had planted herself under the floodlight. She simply held the second phone up and pressed speaker. The first sound that came through was crisp and official, a woman's voice clipped by distance and discipline. "Colonel Hart, this is Joint Operations. Confirm your location." Hayes' eyes flicked to the phone, then to Mara's face, then back to the shoulder patch on her coat, as if he had only just noticed the brass edge catching the light. Mara answered without raising her voice. Roadside stop on Route 17. I have an unlawful detention, tampered search notes, and 2 officers out of regulation. The line went silent for half a beat, and in that silence the whole night seemed to tighten. The older trooper took 1 step back. Hayes tried to recover with a laugh that never found its rhythm. You can't be serious, he said, but his hand had already left the radio. Mara reached into the folder, slid out the top page, and turned it so he could see the embossed header stamped in dark navy ink. His name was there. The unit number was there. The chain of command request he had ignored was there in plain, clean type. He swallowed once hard enough to make his throat move under the collar. You called your people, he asked. No, Mara said, and the answer landed colder than the rain. You did, when you decided this stop needed to become a matter of record. She took 1 slow step closer and set the folder on the hood between them. The metal vibrated under a gust of wind, and the paper edges fluttered like small flags. You have 2 choices, Officer Hayes. You can hand over your badge, your firearm, and your body camera now, or you can keep standing there until the colonel's office explains to the State Patrol why a U.S. Army officer was detained on a shoulder for no lawful reason. The older trooper finally unhooked his handcuffs and laid them on the hood, not on Mara, but beside the folder, as if placing down a verdict he did not want to carry. Hayes stared at them. The cuffs were wet, the steel dark and cold under the floodlight. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I was told he started. Mara cut him off with a glance toward the open road where the faint hum of traffic rolled past in the distance. You were told to do your job, she said. Nothing more. The phone in her hand chimed once. She checked it, then looked up. They're sending a command vehicle, she said, and a statement team. Hayes's shoulders dropped a fraction. The rain traced lines down his badge until the brass looked dull instead of bright. He slowly reached up, unclipped it, and held it out with 2 fingers. Mara did not take it. She only looked at it until he set it on the folder himself. When he did, the cruiser lights flashed across the metal one last time, and for the first time that night, the badge looked small. Mara closed the folder, tucked the second phone away, and stepped back into the rain with the steady posture of a woman who had already outlasted the storm. Now, she said, let's see what kind of officer you are when the uniform is no longer doing the talking.